It's great to be back in Prague. It's been quite a few years since I've been over here, and it's lovely to see a few familiar faces and quite a few that I obviously haven't met before. I say my name's Stephen Ball. I've been around with Embarcadero since 2011. Been developing with Delphi since the end of the 90s. So I think looking around, probably like a lot of you as well. So the session that I'm going to do today, normally we kind of do a product address and those types of things, but I'm sure most of you have been online and been keeping up with what's going on. We're currently on version 11.3, which is the latest version of 11. What we've been trying to do with the product over the last few years specifically is where we now have the update subscriptions running. It's allowing us to do more within point releases. Traditionally in the years gone past, we'd come out and say, hey, here's all the new shiny stuff. And then you get a couple of bug fixes, and then we do a next release, and you'd have to buy the next release. Now, what we try to do to make sure that as developers we can move forward, and for people like Bruno's component vendors, that they can help you for a longer period of time, is that we try to limit the number of breaking changes we have as far as we can. And that typically means that there's some kind of core stuff that needs to be changed and get all the binaries recompiled. But what we are able to do now is make sure that we're able to keep you updated with the latest mobile platforms, the latest distributions on desktop and server as well. But all without having to kind of completely break the version that you're currently running on. So it's a lot easier to keep on to the latest version and to keep moving forward, which I hope, and from what we're hearing, you guys really appreciate as well. So today, I'm going to start off looking into RAD server and looking at some of the different architectures that developers are working with and facing up to today. And the session that I'm doing here is kind of going to build the foundation, really, for some stuff that Antonio is going to look at in the second part later on. Now, if you all have a look at your badges that you've got on you, you'll see there's a QR code. And that QR code is one that we can do a couple of different things with, and Antonio is going to spend a lot of time talking about what's going on with that QR code behind it. But if you chat to some of the staff here today, or if you come and find me, we have an app here written in FireMonkey that we are able to use the data into the app fed from a RAD server backend. So we're going to start talking about the RAD server backend, what that does, how it works. But using the latest version of RAD Studio, it's pretty cool. As staff, we can log in with the biometrics. We can scan the barcode on your badge. It will link up directly to your details. We can, if there's specific things that you're interested in today, let us know. We can just make a note of those. We can get special handouts to you afterwards with that information in it. But again, all of this is because we have a backend that is allowing us to connect remotely to the data and serve it through. And it's a really important thing because today, actually, let's ask a couple of questions first. But who here today is building VCL applications? Pretty much everybody. Who here today has built mobile applications with FireMonkey? Just a few of you, okay. Who here today is getting asked to be able to access the web on their desktop applications remotely? Yeah. So more and more we're being asked to be able to make our data accessible remotely. And the point of really what we're trying to show today is that we have a VCL application that has a database at the back end, like most of yours. We've then got a RAD server implementation to sit alongside it to be able to access into that data. But it's not doing the same thing as the desktop application. It's taking what we need of the data and exposing it through an API, through an application programming interface, that we can then connect into. And if we want to connect into that using FireMonkey, and if we want to connect into it using TMS Web Core, if we want to connect into it using Sentia, JavaScript frameworks, if we want to connect to it using .NET, using a RESTful backend, we can do that and expand out what we have on our client applications today. Okay, so we are going to have a quick look at some of the server architectures. We'll get into talking a bit about RAD server, and then most of this session I'll just sit down, we can do some coding and take you through some examples. So solution architecture has changed quite a lot over time. And if we look back to where we kind of began with the very monolithic design, where everything for your data connection, your business logic was built inside your application. This is one of the ways that RAD became really popular, because it was very, very easy to get up and prototype and get going. Where we kind of moved on to in the 90s with Midas and with the different COM architectures, being able to remote to the data in a much simpler way, we started separating out the business logic, or having the option to separate that business logic from the UI and have that middle tier where we can go and update the middle tier and get that moving and move it forward. If we look at where we are now today, then we are very much moving towards solution architectures where it's about the microservices. It's about bringing different solutions together and being able to make sure that we can bring the best of each of those together to build the complete solution that we're wanting to deliver. So the great thing for you guys is you've been building applications for years. What you have got in abundance is the business logic, the data, and the access to the right stuff to be the foundation, the cornerstone of what your customers are doing, which is why Delphi and the applications you build are so successful. Where we have an opportunity is in taking that and being able to bring this into the kind of microservices type of world. One of the key things really for us as developers is to make sure that we have the right backend in place to move into that type of space. And we'll give an example of why this is kind of working really well today. We've already spoken about uploading stuff to Azure, to different cloud services, using the SaaS-based model to be able to drive into different data centers, to be able to use different components, if they're ones in the box or the ones that TMS are doing, or other third-party vendors, to be able to drive in and access the breadth of different things by getting this common kind of framework to be able to reach out to different places, which from a business point of view is brilliant, because you're not stuck if one company goes out of business. We've seen Pass and Kinvey, having problems in the past. We've seen, it's a big changing landscape. We see certainly in the cloud and with mobile, vendors change things a lot quicker, and they kind of go, 6 months notice, we're going to change this, or we're deprecating that API. You need to update and get ready to move forward. Having components there to help you with that is fantastic. But it's also kind of a risk factor that we need to be able to manage. By being able to build our own stuff out, we can obviously manage that in a very simple way. But also, it means when you are implementing multi-tier applications, you can hide some of that complexity again behind your own API. So you haven't got anything in terms of the field that you need to worry about. You can manage it on the server side. And if we look at the world of technology as a whole, we're seeing a lot more of a shift towards finding the right thing from the right place. Okay, this is probably a really silly question, but who here drives a car? Yeah, it's just a really silly question. It's just to make sure I know how long the translators are behind me. That's what but it's a serious question in the fact that who here has bought a car in the last 5 years? Okay, so we know the guys who've got a bit more money. That's great. We'll come find you later. No, so 10 years ago, my wife bought a new car. The main thing that we worried about was that in the car, we could use a telephone to connect with Bluetooth and make and receive telephone calls to be safe. Okay, that was the main thing internally in the car. Today, it's about, does it have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto? You know, the car manufacturers no longer are going out and trying to build and develop and do all the kind of the interconnections and to build that entertainment system element. They just go and pick it out from the market because it's about finding the right element, the right microservice element to bring in. You know, the world is shifting towards kind of an open innovation approach. And where we can take what we have and our legacy of what we have and to start exposing that in, it opens up a whole breadth of opportunities for us within our marketplaces. So this is why looking at this area is kind of a really important thing for us as developers today. Okay, so what is RAD Server? RAD Server is a framework, and it allows you, it's a full MEAP, so a mobile enterprise application platform, that allows you to build and deploy out applications with a RESTful service in the back end. So I think when we look at what we have today, we're connecting to databases using Delphi components. You know, in terms of databases, who's using SQL Server? No one. Wow. Who's using? Who uses kind of Firebird or Interbase? Yeah. SQL, MySQL. If you Oracle. Wow, there's some money in check, huh? Geez, we're actually in the process internally of ripping out a couple of our Oracle servers because Oracle have just completely tried to change the way they're doing their licensing. They've gone from a license for a number of users who are connecting to the server to a license where you have to license every single person in the organization, which is just bonkers. It's ridiculous. We're seeing customers who are going, our renewals have just gone tenfold. So, you know, if that's a problem for you, then we can chat about Interbase. You know, that's not a problem. But so, I think the best way to describe in terms of what RAD Server provides as a MEAP is if you were going to go and start a restaurant and you turn up and you've got a building and there's nothing in there, then that's a bit like using DataSnap or something in the past. You've got a kind of a basic frame of a shell, or using kind of some basic frameworks. If you turn up at the restaurant and you've got all the tables, you've got the chairs, you've got different zones for different types of customers, you've got all the kitchen equipped, that's more like taking on a MEAP. Everything is there ready to go. So if it's end user security, user groups, multi-tenancy, full detailed analytics. So going back to being part of the microservice economy, you want to know what APIs are being used, how often they're being used, who's using them. that type of information is just pre-built into this. You go build your API and everything gets tracked for you automatically. So that's the kind of the benefit of using something like RAD server. And when it comes to documentation, you can just put some attributes down and it will self-document and give you a full set of documentation ready to go. So it's pretty cool in that kind of way. So I'm going to jump out of my slides because it's always much more entertaining to get in and code and have a little bit of play. So. Okay, so I'm just going to go File, New, and under Other, we have RAD Server. And here we can create a RAD Server package. These can be used on Windows or Linux. Now, you get two options here. You can create an empty package, which if you're adding a package to an existing deployment, then that can be useful. Most of the time, though, you want to create a package with a resource connected in. And even if you're just creating a simple resource, this can be quite a quick way to go. I'm going to give mine a name. I'm just going to call it Test. And I'm going to create this with a data module. I could just create it with a unit. So if I want to put a unit of code, just hand code a whole load of endpoints, and I can do that. But I'm going to use a data module because it's honestly quite a quick way to go. So on the wizard here, we get a few different things to kind of look at. Firstly, we've got here the option to select specific endpoints that we want to create. Now, the sample endpoints here, the get item, post, put, delete, these are similar to kind of a select of a list, select a specific item, insert, update, and delete. Basically, that's the REST equivalent to those database commands. And that verbiage is common across the world of REST. So whichever language you're using, whichever framework, they'll use the same verbiage there. And it's been around for years. It's just the standard HTTP usage. So we can hard code a couple of those. I'm going to leave a couple in there just to show you. In fact, let's just do those to start, and then we can have a look at what that creates. So here we can see I've got my class, which has got an attribute or resource name of test. Now these resource names, these attributes that we add on, are the way that we document and we configure the RAD server endpoints that we're creating. So as we create an endpoint here, what we're actually creating, you can see here, this isn't EXE, this is a BPL. So remember I said RAD server is a bit like having that restaurant that's got everything provided ready to go. Yeah, you just need to turn up and use it. So in the same way, RAD Studio is an IDE that is absolutely there, ready to go. If you want to extend it, you just turn up with your third-party components or whatever you want to add into it. We use the same approach in terms of building RAD server. So you've got the core engine, which is there, that has got all the encryption, the security, everything built into it. And then you just deploy along with it the BPLs, the resources that you want to add. So what this is quite nice for is actually being able to fragment up the different elements that you want to deploy and to be able to literally say, right, well, let's build a package with those endpoints and go deploy it. And if you need to deploy something else, you can go build an additional package and just deploy that additional package. Or you can just replace the one that you're working on. Yeah, update the one that you need. Okay, so we have the resource name. We've got the two items, the get and then the get item. And these are just hard-coded here just to send a response. We're just sending a JSON string back for test for the first one, and test plus the description that's been passed in. So here we can see we have a resource suffix flagged up as an item that's being passed in. That's a parameter that's going to be passed in. The endpoint can then read, and it will then request that and then post it back through. So as we run it, the first time you run, you'll get a little dialog comes up just to ask you to set up the configuration. It takes 2 minutes, next, finished. But we won't go into that today. But as you can see here, we get listed up the endpoints that have been added. So I'm just going to open up here. I can see we have version, and the endpoint we had was called test, and there's test. Now, if I pass in an additional parameter, so for example, hello Prague, we can see that's now been converted and passed through, and that's used the 2 different endpoints here. So really, really simple, really nice way to get going. But most of us are going to be using data. So let's go ahead and build a RAD server endpoint now that uses some data. So we're creating a RAD server package with a resource. I'm going to call it test again. I'm going to use a data module. And I'm going to take off these samples because I don't really need those. But what I do want is I want a database endpoint. So if I choose a database endpoint, I then get a different screen appear. And here, using the Data Explorer, I can rapidly connect to an existing data source. I can choose multiple tables that I want to expose. And what I have now is I have something slightly different. I've got my FIDAC components connecting to the data source. I've got a query. And the query here has got a little bit of, has got a little macro inside. So we can see here, select star from customers. And then we're using the if sort. So this bit gets injected in if the endpoint is using the sort mechanism later on. It will then order it by the sort that's being used. So this allows us to rapidly sort data and also page data based on the sort factor. If I took out the if sort, it would just give me the natural order, and then you can page it based on the natural order and override kind of the paging. You might want to do that if you wanted to kind of get specific pages, but then sort that specific page of data rather than sorting the entire data set. So what this does it allows me a lot of flexibility to sort, for example, by name, and then give X number of records, or to actually just sort the first number of records by name and then the second number of records by name. So pretty useful. So the query is just fetching data. That's standard. We then have this wonderful little component called the TEMS dataset resource. EMS stands for Enterprise Mobility Services, which was the original name of RAD server, hence why you'll see EMS around. Here, I can control on the properties what I can do. So if I can just get a list of items, if I can only get a specific item, if I can insert, update, delete, and again, you can add attributes on for user security later on to be able to control who can access in. And this is connecting up to the data set. Here I can go and define, for example, what the ID field is. We can see there's a number of options to enable paging and params and sorting. There's a page ID, so this is what we're going to use to sort a page. We can set a page size. So I'm going to set a page size of 5, just so we can show the demo. And we also have this sorting param, SF. So the sorting param allows us to say, right, I want to sort, and then we provide the name of the field that we want to sort by, and we combine the two together to be able to get a sorting factor of a field, and then we can tell it if it's ascending or descending. So we'll go and have a look at that in just a second. I'm just going to update the employee one here to be 5 as well. So let's look at the code underneath here. There isn't any. It's all just, we've got a test endpoint as before, and then we've got a resource suffix here for customer and employee. Now you can go change these if you wanted to. So if you've got table names that are very, T127 cust, for example, you can go and change this to customer or whatever you want to do. So this is very easy to go and change how you're going to expose those endpoints. So let's just go ahead and run this. I still have my old one open. Let's close that, try again. So when I hit run here, it's launching up RAD server with the package. We can see here that we've got a number of endpoints that have been put into play. We can see here, for example, we've got test, customer, and then an ID. That's on the delete. We can see the post, the put, the get. So let's just go ahead and interact with these. So I've got my test, and I'm going to choose employee here. And we can see here, this is now bringing me back the employee data. So I mentioned about the sorting factor. So let's just give it a sorting factor. I'm going to use the first name and A for ascending. So you can see here we just put sorting factor, first underscore name equals A. I could sort by phone number, for example, just by changing this to kind of phone extension, or I could change it to job code, job underscore code equals A. So we can now see we've got all the admin job codes together. If I go back and change this to D, that's descending. So we can now see we've got the VP at the top, and then we're moving into sales. So, pretty straightforward, and that's using that sorting factor. So I'm just going to go back here, actually, and sort by the first name. And then also, I'm just going to put a page. I'm just going to do a page equals 1. So remember earlier we set the component to have a page size of 5. So we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 records. So really, really quick, easy control. If you don't want to pull back a million records, just go use the sorting factors, using the paging. Really, really quick to be able to go and fetch that and pull that back. Let's change that to page 2. And we can see now we have the next 5 records. So really nice and flexible way to be able to work through. Okay, so that's a really nice simple example. What I want to do now is move on to a little bit more of a complicated example. And here I've got a FIDAC connection. I've got some data that is coming up from a set of exams which have exam questions, and each exam question is multiple choice, so it has a set of answers. So here we can see we've got quite a complicated select statement going on. Here we're doing a join on the questions so we can get back the number of questions for each exam. So how do you start using the automatic posting of the updates when you've got a kind of complicated query? Well, you can use an update SQL component. Using this here, we can define out the insert, the update, the delete, and we can use the wizard to reconnect it quite quickly. If we double click on it here, would you like to execute that? Not right now, but so we can go ahead and modify those. But we're then still using master detail relationship like we would do normally with database connections. So here I've got my query with my EMS dataset resource to provide out the data. Now I've got my exams, and I'm using where exam ID equals exam ID. So here we are using a T data source to connect to the original query. And on the second query, just like we would in a normal VCL application, we're saying, hey, we're indexing on this field, here's the master field, here's the master source. So once I've got the data from here, go and update that and provide it back here. And we're able to do master detail and even master detail based on that. So the component setup is pretty straightforward. What do we have to do in terms of serving that out? Well, here I've got my resource name. So instead of calling it test, this one's called exams. I then have a resource suffix. So I've chosen to use the base point of exams to give me back some data. So let's go ahead and run that, and we can see that, and we can jump back and forth. Oh, wrong app. So here's my list of exams. You know, otherwise I'd have exams and then exams as the table. I don't want that. I just want to be able to get directly to the exams. So here they are. Now if I want exam, for example, 352. Exam 352. There's the exam, there's the detail. Okay. So what I really want now is I want exam 352, but I want the questions. Okay, there's the questions. So we can start seeing how this is building up as a UI, as an API, sorry. So the questions. The questions take an exam ID, and then they take a, oh, hello. And then we have the endpoint of questions. So it's happening weird with the screen. Are you seeing that as well? So there we have the exam ID, questions, that gives us that back. Now, when we have the select, the inserts, the updates, the deletes, again, we're going to have different types of documentation that we need to push in there, and different parameters. Again, we can document those in using the resource suffix. For the guest, the list, the post, we can tell it about the type of parameter that's being passed in. So, this is a parameter on the path. It's an ID. It's an integer. It's a 64-bit int. Again, we can give it some documentation here, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And then we've got the answers as well. So we've got an exam ID with questions, then a question ID, and then the answers that go with that question ID. So let's go back. We've got the question here. So the question ID here, we can see at the top is 353. There's the question. But what are the answers? Well, they're the two options for answers. We can see this is the correct one, and this is the false one. So it's a true or false. We can see which is the correct one there. So that's quite fragmented as an API goes. It kind of gets you directly where you want to go. You can call directly what you want very easily. But if you had an exam that had 90 questions, you don't want to do 90 API calls to get the questions, and then another 90 API calls to get the answers for each one of those questions. That's just crazy. So if you get to that kind of instance, then you can create a custom endpoint very easily to serve out some data. So here we have an endpoint with an exam ID and an endpoint name of questions full. And this is using the get method. Similar to what we saw earlier. Here I've just got a method to convert a record into a JSON object. So it just loops here through each of the fields, excludes the master field because we've already got that listed in the record above, and then just writes the property and the value. Nice and simple, okay? Here we're just fetching the exam ID. We're then setting the parameter on the query and opening the query. And if we don't get an exam come back, we send an invalid response. And we send a 404 back. Yeah, invalid exam. And then we just do something really simple. We start writing a JSON object. We just go to the first record. And then we just loop the data set. We create an object for each question. Use the JSON array to convert that record into the object response. We then set that we're about to put the answers in, and that's a JSON array. We put that in. We just loop through each of the answers and convert it into the data set. Nice and easy. So not a lot to do. If we go back to the exams here. So let's go and have a look. We've got exams here, and if we just say questions full, we can now see we've got every single one of the questions passed back. We can see the question and the different answers. So this now is a really simple one API call to get the full data set with the master detail embedded into it, ready to do something on the client side. So really, really simple to get up and getting going. So how do we start calling these endpoints from a Delphi application? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, in fact, leave. Yeah, let's leave that running for the moment. And under the tools, we can go find the wonderful REST debugger. Who here has used the REST debugger before? 4 or 5 hands, okay. So the REST debugger can be used with any REST API. So I was talking about microservices. One of the places there is an awful lot of really good microservices today, or endpoints that you can go call. Obviously, there's Azure, and the marketplace there. There's obviously AWS, they've got a whole load of stuff there, the translation services, name it, there's loads of stuff. But there's one called API Layer, where you can go and set up a free account and you can start playing with a whole set of APIs. It's another one of the companies in the Idea group. But they've got a huge marketplace online that you can go register up and just get connecting and playing. And there's things for checking what the weather's going to be. There's stuff for passing in different bits of food that you've got and coming back with recipe ideas. There's loads and loads and loads of different types of APIs out there that you can go call and use. There's some that are really good for banking, for example. You can pass a credit card number in, and it will come back and tell you who the issuing bank is. If it's a well-formed credit card number, it will kind of help give you some information about it. And there's ones for pushing in a bank details, and it will confirm the SWIFT number, if the banking details match in with the checksums. There's a whole load of information you can get back just from being able to pass in one little bit of information, get everything back through. There's another one they're working on at the moment with a company that has access to all the barcodes. I didn't know until I was chatting with this person on a plane end of last year. Each barcode that is in the shops, there's a global database of barcodes that are managed by this consortium. And they can trace the barcode back to the point of origin. And that barcode is then registered against specific companies. So you can kind of get a lot of information off the actual physical barcode if you know where to go look for it. So if you've got a retail system or a POS system and you're trying to sell stock or anything else like that, being able to go and fetch that information back, you can start automatically populating a whole load of information, know who the supply, the original source manufacturer of this stuff is before it gets going, which can be quite interesting. But microservices and being able to use these things through REST can add a lot into your applications quite quickly. So let's go ahead and start using our API. So here we can send a quick request here. I'm looking at localhost, which is my server here. Localhost. I've got a parameter set up here, exams 1, questions 4. So saying give me the first exam. And I can see I've got some data come back. That's good. I can have a look at this as tabular data. So now I'm converting that JSON array into what looks like a data set. Pretty cool, huh? And now what I can do is I can just go copy components. And what it's done is it's copied a T-REST client. So if you think of the T-REST client a bit like a database connection, so that says this is where my RESTful server is. And then the T-REST request, which is the endpoint. So this is like select start from table. This is the endpoint that I'm going to go and get the data from. And then the response is a bit like the data set that's then bringing the data back in. It's just a big JSON data. What are we going to do with that now? Well, we use the REST response dataset adapter to convert that JSON array directly into a memory table, a fire.mem table. So without having to do any code, any component configuration, I can just now go in here and let's go create a new project. That could be a VCL or a FireMonkey project. I can just paste these components down. So you can see I'm a client with my request. I can execute the request in terms of inside here. And I can actually now go ahead and view the data set that's come back. So I can now connect any data set components to this, either using kind of data-aware components or using live bindings. So let's just go ahead and add a data source down, connect that to the mem table, and let's put a DB grid down. There we are, we've got the data straight through, that design time ready to play with. So that's really nice and easy. In terms of executing it at runtime, it's a really complicated line of code. REST request, whatever you're going to name it. Obviously, I've called mine 1 because that's a really good name. I'm going to be able to be very clear about what it is later on in life. But we just need to tell it to execute. At runtime, that is all we need to do to go and execute that REST request, which is pretty nice. So we have on there a nested data set. So if we just come back here, I'm going to send the request again. I'm going to click on the column here that I actually want to get into, which is the answers. So we can see here now we have a root element that we're actually fetching back. If I copy the components now, that will then give me a new set of components, and I can go ahead and use those. However, I've got one that I made a little bit earlier, so I'm just going to jump back here. Because I've done a little bit of naming of the components to make it a little bit easier to see. So we've got the REST client. I've got my initial request, which is going to the exams endpoint. And that returns the data into here, which comes into my dataset adapter, and then down to my mem table. So let's go ahead and execute here. So you can see my data set. Now, with the exam, when I select the exam, I then want to get the questions and the answers for each exam. So let's go ahead and execute that here. this is using the single API call to the exam, and then I've got the parameter marked in here, exam ID. So we actually set that as a parameter in the resource URL, and then to the endpoint questions full. So if we actually have a look at the parameters, we can see I've got my exam ID in here, and that it's got a default ID now. So the response comes into here, but then I actually want to do two things with the response. I want the questions, and I want the answers. So I have two dataset adapters that are working off the same response. So a single response is then getting worked in two different ways. The first one is creating the mem table with the questions in. So here we see the questions. And the second one, we actually have that root element set. So if you remember from the REST debugger, we selected the column that we wanted to drill into and applied, and that gave us the root element. Well, here we've got the root element set up. So that's pretty cool. I then got my dataset adapters connected in. And if we go and have a look at the form here, my main form, I've just got a method to call to load. Now, that's a method of my data module. And there's a little extra coding that I've done in here just to allow the master detail to work very quickly. But we execute the request to get the answers, so the exams. And then we need to clear the root node because we don't know how many root elements are going to be coming back. So we can't set an index yet. So we just clear that out of the way. We then set the parameter for the questions full. So we're on exam 1. So let's go get exam 1. We're on exam 352. Let's go get exam 352. And then we execute that. And then once that's loaded, we're able to then set the after scroll so it doesn't do it for every single one that it runs down. And then here we are. We just say, okay, well, let's clear our root element. Let's go ahead and set the parameters, execute the question full. So we're getting the exam ID coming through. And we're then able to, after the scroll, reset the ID to get the detail for the one that we're on. So not a lot of work, but a couple of lines of work. But what that allows us to do now is to have a really simple endpoint that we can navigate through the questions and the answers and see the different bits coming back through here. So you can see we've got different types of questions and answers working through. So that's pretty cool. A really quick way to be able to convert that data out and get it working. So you can see it's a very fast connection. Just simple data sets that are being pushed back and forth. Okay. So I'm just going to remove that before I close. Okay, so I want to go back and start looking at updating data. We've looked at how we can fetch it, how we can serve it out very quickly, how we're now in a position to allow other people to connect into our data sets very quickly as well. There's a sample up on GitHub, and you can go ahead and download this. It's on my GitHub page. There is a really, really simple one. Again, we've got the client connecting to our data here. It's very simple, select staff and tasks, the dataset resource. So we've seen how to build that in 2 seconds, yeah. Let's just close that server and relaunch the other one. So the fetch is bringing back a list of tasks. And what I want to show you now is actually how we're working with this on the client side. So at the client side, pretty straightforward. We have got our execute to go fetch the data and bring it back in. The memory table that we've got, we're then applying cached updates. So what cached updates does is it tracks in the data set changes that are being made. Now, you can apply these back immediately if you want to. But what you can also do is you can use the memory table to go fetch a whole load of data, to save it, to cache and work with it locally. You can even work offline with it, but then later on you want to push those changes back to the server. Then cached updates is a great way to be able to track those changes in the data set. And it tracks the differences in the delta property. And the delta tells us if it's an insert, an update, a delete. It tells us which fields changed. So we can track those really closely. And then we have an additional button here. One, just to show the change count that we have on the data set, so we know how many changes we've got. And the second one is we're using a TREST dataset updater. Now, this is a class that we pass in the REST client. The reason we pass the REST client in is that's, as I said, that's like the database connection. So that's got all the authentication, the security that allows us to access the endpoints defined. So we pass in that connection. And then we have the path, or the endpoint that we want to use. So here we've got data tasks. That's where the data set is. So if we go data tasks, we can see our list of data. That's it, that's our endpoint. And we've got tasks ID, which is the ID field in our data set locally. And then we're passing in the mem table, which has got all the data that's got the delta changes in there. So what we do is we tell this to apply updates remotely, apply the remote updates. And once it's done, if there's an error, it logs it onto the screen, but otherwise it just frees and off we go. So let's go and do that, and then we'll have a look at what's going on behind the scenes. So I've got a line here. Let's get rid of foo. We don't need foo on that. And let's change this one to completed. Now if we have a look at our change count, we can see we've got 2 changes in the delta. If we hit save, we have everything done. If we go back here, what we can see is that we've had a couple of lists, and then we've had the 2 put methods that have been updating those 2 records that have changed. And then we've done another list to pull the data back again. So we can see all that logged here, and we can see the IP address that it's come from, which is especially useful when you're trying to test and configure things with multiple users. We can see the resource that was called, which was data. So yeah, pretty straightforward. Let's have a look at the code underneath here. So this REST data updater unit. Inside here is a transport. That transport makes those connections that we need for doing the REST connection and getting the response back. It uses that internally. You can override, when you create it, it automatically sets up the endpoints and the endpoints and how they're being used. If you ever have a REST API that's not using the normal conventions, you can override those once you create the component, but it automatically does the work for you because 99% of the time it's going to be exactly what it needs to be. It sets up the data set and the field, and then the method to log the changes in. It just checks we've got the data set, checks we've got the client, checks we've got the field. If not, you'll get an error message pop up. And then it runs through posting those changes in. So it uses a transport, sets the mode that it's, if it's a post, a put, delete, and then executes against the data set. Nice and simple. So really, really simple just to get those changes pushed back. As again, you can go modify that, play with it, do what you want to do with it, but it's a really nice little class just to help perform those remote actions. So we've seen how to set up a server, we've seen how to connect to our existing data sets, we've seen how to customize an endpoint, we've seen how to pull down master detail relationship, we've seen how to be able to post remotely back very quickly using existing dataset components changes to a remote endpoint. So what I want to just finish off with is having a look at the documentation, which I said we'd get to, and how you can see that in action. So what you've seen as we've been running, there's this Open Console button on the top of RAD Server here. Now this is the developer version. This just shortcuts to launch the exe which is on the machine. Now when you set up, you'll set up a username and password for the console. Here I can see the number of users who I've got active. I've got one user who's been active. Again, you can see if you've got multiple tenants, you can see which tenants they belong to and all those types of things. You can set up groups. So when you've got multiple users, security groups running. So going back to your badges, Antonio will show you, we'll talk to you later on about how he's used the security groups to allow for the website to be able to call specific APIs. But then the application that we've been using as staff to actually be able to call different APIs and to be able to do different types of actions as well. And you can manage those via groups and then assign the users to the groups, which makes it very easy to manage access rights. There's also a thing in here for installations, which we haven't got any at the moment. That's really for the edge points. You can deploy just a RAD server instance, and then you can deploy another RAD server instance that, not another RAD server instance. There's components that you can install and use in your Delphi application to connect to a RAD server instance, and that then becomes an installation. So for example, if you had a hospital and you had your RAD server instance, but then you needed to be able to use some scales that connect to the computer via Bluetooth, what you can do is you can actually use the local computer and an application there to connect to the scales, and you can make that computer a remote installation of the RAD server API. So you can then query to find out where the installations are, and you can then ask that set of scales via a remote API to go and weigh the person who is there. So even if you had a web application that you were working in, you can then actually ask via that web application, just by calling the API, to go get that installation, to go weigh the person and bring the value back and record it against the record. So that's what those are for. That's pretty kind of cool. And again, you can log in and see what instances are there, once the installations, which edge module points are running, which resources are being connected up and available through those, and so on. But the bit that we really want to have a look at here is the analytics. We can see the clients that are being run, how often they've been run through, and so on. We can have a look at the calls that have been made. I've made some today, made some yesterday as well. We can kind of drill into those calls as well. So we can start having a look at the endpoints that have been called. Here we can see the different exam endpoints that have been called and so on. So you can start drilling into the data with the date ranges and so on, and get quite a good idea about what's been called, how often it's been called, and so on. And you can start really separating out to the specific elements that you want to see. Again, going back to what I said earlier, being part of a wider ecosystem, you want to know what's being used, when's it being used, because then that helps you in terms of defining maintenance schedules, also in terms of what you maintain as an endpoint, because if things are not being used, should we be keeping them? It's budget cost that we have to manage. But also, if you put stuff out there and it's not being used, it's good to see that it's not being used, so you can then maybe action or update applications that still need to be using it, or if legacy applications are still calling some of the older API points that you want to deprecate later on, that kind of thing. Really, really useful to kind of get into. Okay. So we will make these slides available to you. All the links are going to be available to you afterwards. There's a really good white paper that was done. It's a few years old, and actually Antonio's in the middle of updating it. So we should have that out in a few months' time. Yep, he's turning into quite a RAD server expert with stuff that he's doing, which is brilliant. There's also a whole load of stuff on YouTube. If you go to GitHub as well, you can get the I haven't got the link up there actually, but if you just go to my blog, delphiaball.co.uk, and then click on the RAD server, you'll be able to find the links to all the bits there as well. Now, there are some licensing considerations with RAD server. The Enterprise Edition is required for all the components that come with it. The Enterprise Edition includes a license for running it on a single site. So if you have an enterprise and you want to install it and use it in there, you just need a single enterprise license. You can do that. The Architect Edition includes a multi-site license, so you can run that over multiple sites. So, for example, you had an office in the UK and one in China and one in Spain. You wanted to have different installations there, then you could use that license. The Lite Edition doesn't have any licensing restrictions on it. You can deploy that as much as you want. It's exactly the same as the full Server Edition. It just isn't really set to scale to massive quantities of users. But that said, you can still get some decent scale out of it. You know, we've got people who are using 30, 40 people against it quite happily. It uses Interbase IB Lite inside of it for the user management. RAD server by itself has a copy of Interbase embedded that comes along with it, that is part of it, and is only for its use. And that includes all the user security, the monitoring, all the data that's been collected is encrypted and stored securely within that database instance. So you can then still go connect to whichever database you want. If you want to connect to Interbase as well, then you just deploy a separate version of Interbase or Firebird along with it to then be able to connect and use that as your main data store. But if you want to deploy the full version, then there is an OEM program, and it really depends on what you're charging your customers, how your model works. Just talk to the sales guys, and they can sort all that non-techie stuff out pretty quickly. Okay, so I think that's really it from me. I say, if you're not on the latest version, download. Who here has got 11.3 already? Few hands. Okay. Who's on 11? A few more. Who's on 10? Something. Or 10.4, should I say? Okay. Anybody on anything a lot older? What version? 10.3. Okay. I say, yeah, if you need to ask Antonio himself or even Bruno any questions about getting to the latest version or migrating or anything, then please do let us know. But loads of stuff online just to be able to grab hold of. So, yeah. Oh, not talk to AlphaSoft, talk to the guys here at EMBT. Sorry. Legacy message from an old presentation. So, great, guys. That's the default slide long. Thank you very much. I think we're now going to have a break again for some more drinks and snacks and stuff. So if anybody has any questions, then please do shout. Otherwise, we can all carry on outside. So. Okay, we're around in the break, so please, just come find us if you have any questions.